Okay, hopefully this take works, but because that fucking first one got messed up. I really shouldn't use harsh language in the middle of talking about Mr. Rogers, but I am going to talk about the recent movie that came out in his memory, Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. And it's not really a beautiful day in the neighborhood for the main one of the main characters in this movie. The story, in case you don't know, is a bitter, cynical journalist has now taken on the job of interviewing Mr. Rogers to try and clear up his public reputation by recommendation of his editor at Esquire. And Lloyd Vogel goes to interview Mr. Rogers, not thinking he's the real thing, only to find something more powerful, a message about forgiveness and redemption at a point in his life when he really needs to learn those lessons. So, right off the bat, this isn't exactly what you think it's going to be. Most people who are going to see this, myself included, are going to think going in that this is going to be a biopic about Mr. Rogers' life and the typical sense of beginning and then up to the current point in his life, which is 1998 when the actual story came out. Because this is based on a true story about a profile piece that was written on Mr. Rogers in 98. But the writer was not Lloyd Vogel, it was Tom Janot. And Tom Janot, from what I've researched, did not have any of the emotional baggage that Lloyd had in the movie. But I think it's kind of a cool idea that they framed this like a Mr. Rogers episode. They frame it in the way, from the very beginning, they have Mr. Rogers or Tom Hanks doing the routine where he takes off his jacket, takes off his shoes, puts on a sweater, and it just goes into this really funny transition that you see throughout the movie where you have a cheesy looking model and the camera pans over in the other direction to another cheesy model that then transforms into the location that's going to be used at that point in the story. So I thought that was a really cool way to do a transition and also to pay homage to Mr. Rogers, who's been dead for 16 years. And let's get to Mr. Rogers right now. With Tom Hanks, he does a good job at capturing the spirit of Mr. Rogers, and he tries to mimic the speech patterns. The problem is you're asking a guy to do you're asking a guy to do Mr. Rogers, and the guy in question has a very distinct, high pitched, nasally voice from time to time that is not really matching what Mr. Rogers' voice sounds like. It's not like James Franco in Disaster Artist where he really matches the impression of the character and the person he's portraying perfectly. But at least with Tom Hanks, he does get the man down. The likability, the very friendly demeanor, being patient, never having a bad word to say about anybody. And I don't know why the lighting on my computer is bouncing around like this, but this thing sucks. So what are you gonna do? So Tom Hanks did a great job at capturing the spirit of Mr. Rogers. He didn't get everything perfectly, but I feel like that's kind of a nitpick. I feel like one thing that could be a knock against the movie is that there is one really weird scene where Vogel has a nervous breakdown from the pressures of his family life and his father being in the hospital. Because they do set up early on that Vogel has a lot of emotional anger, a lot of anger facing his father, and just a lot of hatred towards his dad. And there's a scene where the dad ends up in the hospital, and Lloyd runs off to see Mr. Rogers to get some counseling, I guess you could say, and he just collapses there on set. And it goes into this very weird fever dream where he ends up being one of the puppets in the show. That is really weird. And yeah, um, and the one thing I will say is that the movie it does have a big message about forgiveness and redemption, which is a really inspiring message. And I feel like that this movie it's kind of coming at a time where a lot of people are having very pessimistic views about the world, especially in this country. So it's kind of nice to see a movie that's kind of dark, kind of gritty, but then has an uplifting message. It's it's kind of similar to the same tone and the same point of Shawshank Redemption, where you go through some dark stuff to get to the lighthearted. This probably wasn't the best comparison, but there you go. Um, I'm trying to think of other bits in there that I could complain about. I think other than the transitions being weird and that one dream sequence being very bizarre, and the fact that I think aside from the stuff I've already mentioned, I think those are the only real flaws I can knock against the movie. I do think that as far as it being a classic is concerned, I think it's a little too early to tell. I mean, it is a good movie. It's getting a lot of critical acclaim and stuff, but I think we're probably gonna have to wait a few years before we see whether this movie is a classic. But I think if you're a Mr. Rogers fan, you're gonna love it. Well, you're gonna love how he's portrayed. He's not really in the movie as much. The story is more on Vogel and his arc towards becoming a better family man and forgiving his father for the sins of the past. And another thing that I really like, and this is probably the last bit I'll close out, is that they got the fact that Mr. Rogers was a vegetarian, swimmer, pianist, and they also got down the fact that he was a very religious man. But they do it in such a subtle way that kind of makes you believe in what he's believing, as opposed to rolling your eyes and then kind of thinking, yeah, yeah, sure, we know what you're trying to sell. You know, it just seems a little more genuine and real. And that's pretty much all I have to say. And I am just going to pause after saying goodbye because I don't want to do the whole thing all over again. So I'll see you guys next week.